Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Andrew. And also thank you for all that you did to organize this. It's always wonderful when something is done for you and all you have to do is show up, essentially. And Andrew Outen is obviously a pro. I'd also like to thank the Society of the Cincinnati because the work that they and other private organizations do to preserve Revolutionary era history is now more important than ever, I would say. And a special thanks to the experts who staff museums and archives like those at the library and the museum here at Anderson House and care for their collections. Because without the work that those people do, those expert archivists and curators and registrars, we would not be able to, we being historians, would not be able to tell you the stories that we put together. And of course, thank you all for braving the what sounds like a sort of terrifying night of weather and spending your time with me tonight. So I'd like to start by showing you the cover, which I had nothing to do with. So, I love it, but can take zero credit for it, in part because it's given me a wonderful opportunity to embarrass my Gen Z children, which, if you can embarrass your children with your book cover, what's not to love about that? Because I've been saying to everyone who will listen, I love this cover. It's so fire. So, it's something that I can start off with embarrassing my children, and it works every time with that. And so even though this cover indicates that I'm talking about artists, I'm actually going to start with a piece of art that no longer exists. And it no longer exists because it was most likely lost at sea off the coast of Maine. And I'm not going to begin in any of the usual suspects of a history of the American Revolution. I'm not going to begin in New England or Virginia or Philadelphia, but in London. More precisely, in London's Royal Academy of Art. So picture the scene, the Royal Academy of Art, which you see here, in London, 1780, crowded with pictures, as you can tell in this image, including new portraits of King George and Queen Charlotte by Benjamin West. And you see Queen Charlotte's new portrait there on the right. But also among the portraits that year was the debut painting entry by 22-year-old Joseph Wright, a promising award-winning Royal Academy student, notable for being one of the first Americans to study there. So this was Joseph's first splash onto the big art scene. And although his painting was just one of many portraits in the show, it was one of the most widely remarked upon pieces that year. So his entry showed his famous mother, American wax sculptor Patience Wright, whom you see on the left. This is not his portrait. This is another portrait of her that was published in a popular magazine. And you can see she's modeling a head on her lap. And she was sort of famous for this method of modeling heads. A lot of wax sculptors worked from casts, or they would, put the figure up and mold it in front of them. She was famous for, she was a little bit of an impresario, like a P.T. Barnum before P.T. Barnum. She would put the head of wax under her skirts and model the features of the person she was looking at before whipping it out fully formed to the delight of the people viewing. So I doubt seriously that she fully formed this under her lap without looking because that's not the way art works, but she knew how to make a show. And so she was famous in part for this method. And so when Joseph Wright made a portrait of his mother modeling a head on her lap, as in this case, it got people's attention and they knew exactly who she was. What was interesting was that the head was the decapitated head of King Charles I, England's king, famously decapitated by his own subjects during the English Civil War. And looking down at her working were busts of George and Charlotte. So it was, as everyone who saw it knew, a portrait of regicide and the threat of future regicide. And it created a sensation. But reactions to this portrait varied widely. And this was, to me, one of the most interesting parts of this story when I stumbled across this archive, because this is 1780. This is 5 years into the war. And yet, although some called it an insult to decency, even treasonous, others saluted it as an entertaining defense of constitutional liberties. And here you can see Joseph Wright created this image of himself soon after he displayed his portrait of his mother, and he titles his self-portrait Yankee Doodle or American Satan. So he is willingly taking on this image of, taking one for the team of America. But so the clashing opinions about this portrait and the fact that it was at London's Royal Academy on display at all reminds us that the war we now call the American Revolution was fought on both sides of the Atlantic by artists as well as soldiers, and in the courts of public opinion, as well as on the battlefield. But art, like many things, does not always survive the havoc of history, as this black screen symbolizes. What's preserved in our museums is only a tiny bit of what was once created and seen. Wright's portrait of his mother, for example, survives only in archival documentation, like letters and newspapers. The portrait itself must be imagined, for it cannot be seen. It likely, as I mentioned, was lost at sea. So in 1781, Joseph Wright left London for Paris. You can imagine he wasn't doing so great after that Royal Academy debut. And then in 1782, with the help of the Wrights' family friend, Benjamin Franklin, he made plans to return to the United States, sailing on a Boston-bound ship. After a 10-week journey, battling gusts of snow-filled wind, on its last day at sea, the ship approached the Maine coast and ran aground on a pile of rocks. Now, although the passengers managed to make it ashore, much of the ship's cargo, which included Wright's paintings, was lost, washed out of the ship's hold, or sunk below the waves. So Joseph Wright's portrait of his mother holding the decapitated head of Charles I may have sunk under the Atlantic, but though it is physically lost, it offers an invaluable window into the revolutionary past. And so in my book, I trace the fact that much as we can dive to retrieve shipwrecked things from the bottom of the sea, we can tell histories that allow us to see previously submerged stories about the past. Just because they're submerged or hidden doesn't mean they're not there. And in The Painter's Fire, I bring these revolutionary portraits up from the depths of the past and into the light. This allows us to see a new transatlantic history of the American Revolution and the creative people who made it, one that transforms the way we think of the nature of patriotism, then and now. Now, this art and these artists are important to this story because the American Revolution was not only fought in the colonies with muskets and bayonets. On both sides of the Atlantic, artists armed with paint, canvas, and wax played an important role in forging revolutionary ideals. From London to Boston, from Jamaica to Paris, and from Bath to Philadelphia, these largely forgotten patriots risked their reputations and their lives to declare independence. And at the center of The Painter's Fire are the lives of three of these remarkable such artists devoted to the pursuit of liberty: Robert Edge Pine, Prince Demah, and Patience Wright, Joseph Wright's mother. And in part because of who they were, women, men of color enslaved and free, and Britons living in England, these patriot artists were mostly excluded from formal military or political power in the United States. Instead, they fired salvos against the king on the walls of the Royal Academy, as well as on the battlefields of North America. They used their talents to inspire rebellion, define American patriotism, and fashion a new political culture, often alongside other more familiar figures like Benjamin Franklin and Phyllis Wheatley. And together, their experiences testify both to the promise and the limitations of liberty in the founding era. So a snapshot look at each of them. Robert Edge Pine, who created what to your eyes probably looks like a somewhat idiosyncratic portrait of George Washington on the left, was an award-winning British artist rumored to be of African descent. And what he did was infuse massive history paintings with politics, eventually emigrating to the young United States, where he opened America's first grand art museum in Philadelphia. More on that later. Prince Demah, whose portrait of a Scottish merchant living in Boston you see on the right, was the first identifiable enslaved portrait painter in America. And he was Pine's pupil in London before he self-emancipated in Boston and enlisted to fight for the patriot cause in Massachusetts. And Patience Wright, whose sole surviving full-sized wax figure you see there in the middle, was a Long Island-born wax sculptor who became a sensation in London, loudly advocating for revolution while acting as an informal patriot spy. So a British artist of mixed race, an enslaved painter, and a woman sculptor. These are exceptional people, but what I hope to show you tonight is that they're also not unique, and I think that's important. Together, they, their families, and their larger networks, which included more famous revolutionary figures like Ben Franklin, Paul Revere, John and Abigail Adams, George and Martha Washington, and Phyllis Wheatley, give us a new transatlantic history of the American Revolution that is fascinating, complex, creative, bizarre, and the most serious scholarly term I'm going to use tonight, wackadoodle. So Robert Edge Pine, whose work you see here, also painted people who were friends to and heroes of the American cause. So people like British historian Catherine Sawbridge Macaulay, who you see there in her guise as a Roman senator, leaning against her books, discussing the history of the British empire. And, in case you don't get it, she's meant to be an icon of republicanism, right? And then on the right, his famous portrait, and I say famous because it was copied into prints that circulated all around the British Empire, of John Wilkes, the unfortunately unattractive but very famous British politician who was thrown in jail without due process, without the his right of habeas corpus being upheld for defaming the king and his ministers. And so Pine's choice of subjects is not accidental. He's Republican, he's egalitarian. One of my favorite things I found out about Robert H. Pine is that he was the member of this group called the Society of Artists, which are sort of a precursor to and parallel to the Royal Academy of Art. And a lot of members of the Society of Artists refused to join the Royal Academy when it was formed because it was not Republican enough. It was too aristocratic, too monarchical. So Robert H. Pine was one of those people. But he used to be an elected member of the officers of the Society of Artists. He thought the current president was being very anti-democratic in the way he was running things. And so he wrote him a letter and resigned in, high indignation. But then he looked at the bylaws and he was like, oh, I can't do that. The members have to vote me out. So he rescinded his resignation, put himself back on the officers board, and then asked for the members to vote him out so that he could uphold the Republican standard of the time at hand. And to me, that's a lot of back and forth just to be able to uphold, the bylaws of your institution. So Robert Edge Pine, definitely painting the people who match his own politics. He's also likely of mixed race. So this is his father, John Pine, who is William Hogarth's good friend, his fellow Mason, had royal appointments to King George II, ran a print shop on St. Martin's Lane, and sold engravings like the ones he created, such as the so-called Rokes map of London from the 1740s, which you've all seen everywhere. So Pine then was part of this really important, well-connected family of British artists with royal appointments, etc. And they were all centered in St. Martin's Lane in London. And here you see an image of part of St. Martin's Lane and the house at the top right where you see the man working and he's dressed very much like an artist at work. That's either Robert Edge Pine's house or his house is very near it. And so St. Martin's Lane is this place where you have artists and artisans and tradespeople, women as well as men, including ones who are famous then and now, like Thomas Chippendale. So these highly trained people working not just in painting and sculpting, but in engraving, frame making, and cabinet making. And their skills and shops collectively made St. Martin's Lane famous. So then this is where Prince Demah, enslaved artist from Massachusetts, found himself training in 1770 to 1771. Now think about what a change this would be from Boston, much less Marlborough, which had been his home base for the last few years, where he was one of only 5 enslaved people in the entire town. So not least, this would have been a shock to him, probably a happy one, because while St. Martin's Lane introduced him to a bustling, vibrant world of art, in large part, London was a city that was not just the capital of the British Empire and center of its artistic production, but also the hub of the Black Atlantic, largely because so many Black sailors came in and out, among other things. And before he was a painter, Prince Demah was a mariner. And so London is an interesting place for Prince Demah to be because one of the reasons he ends up there is that John Singleton Copley in Boston refused to train him because he was a Black man. And so Robert Edge Pine, though, agrees to train Prince Demah, who's taken over with his enslavers' encouragement, agrees to train him. He tells his enslavers without any charge because he's a genius. But I think also, obviously, the shared African heritage is playing in here. And so this is this really interesting moment in time in which Prince Demah's in London training with a man of African descent. And his enslaver doesn't know he's training with a man of African descent. He just thinks he's a well-connected British painter. And ironically, when he's there, he says, I won't let Prince Demah talk to anyone of his own color because I don't want him getting ideas about seizing his own freedom in London. Never knowing the whole time that he was enmeshed in this family of mixed-race artists, egalitarian leaning mixed-race artists. And so while Pine was training Demah, he was working on this 1771 history painting. This is a print copied after the painting, which again, anytime a print is made of a painting, it tells you it did well and, it's going to be popular. So this shows a famous scene from the year 1278, famous at the time, not famous to us now, in which the Earl of Warren is defending his property by force, by the sword if necessary, against arbitrary seizure by the crown. And so the political decisions that both Demah and Pine made later makes me wonder what they talked about in Pine's studio while he was working on this painting, no doubt teaching Prince Demah as he went, because this sends a very timely message about current politics in Britain's North American colonies. This idea of defending your property against illegal seizure by a tyrannical king, right? In the 1770s, this has some resonance. And so politics are a large part of this story of Prince Demah because even though his enslaver, Christian Barnes, the wife of Henry Barnes, who you see here, not long before he left to London, wrote that she wanted to believe that he was, quote, of Tory principles because he was born in our family. She confessed, of that I am not quite so certain as he has not yet declared himself. So Christian's comments point to Prince's diplomatic skill at negotiating the complications of sharing a household with his enslavers, who were also weirdly his art patrons. So Christian Barnes was the one who really pushed for him to study in London. She wanted him to become a professional painter. She thought he was a genius. She called him her Black Hogarth in a reference to the famous painter William Hogarth, who ironically was friends with the man who eventually taught him his father. And she got into her head that he could be this genius, a sort of pet project. And Christian Barnes is a really interesting figure. I think a really important reminder that people in the past, just like people today, are very nuanced. They're not black and white. Because on the one hand, she's training this enslaved painter to the extent that she sends him across the ocean to train in London to get the training that he can't get in Boston. That's a big, that's a big investment in his potential and future. At the same time, she's also saying there are a number of young girls living in her house who work in their mercantile shop. And she says, I really want these girls, once they're 18, to enter into shopkeeping on their own and really show men that women can do anything men can do. And she talks about being bored, being stuck at home, and wishes that women could do more in the world. So these are all things that make you say, Christian Barnes, what a fascinating person. On the other hand, there are three people enslaved in the Barnes household when Prince Demah is there. His mother, Daphne, who was stolen from Africa as a young girl and enslaved by the Barnes family ever since. And then Prince Demah himself, and then a woman called Juliet. So Juliet takes up this relationship with not another enslaved person in Marlborough, but nearby in Massachusetts, Jack. Jack and Juliet, their romance is encouraged by Christian Barnes. Um, they get married. This is not legal for enslaved people at the time, but their enslavers both condone it. They get married. Juliet has a baby. She gives birth to the baby in Christian Barnes's best bed in her house, which Christian Barnes does, with Prince Demah's mother, Daphne, serving as midwife. Once the baby is born, however, Christian Barnes says, I don't want this baby around. And she either gives it away or sells it to someone else in another town. And then later, Juliet, still married to Jack, gets pregnant again. And this time, the baby is born, and it's clear that it's not Jack's baby, which means it must have been a mixed race baby, which leads you to think that Juliet was either in a relationship with a white man or raped by a white man, and probably the latter because she and Jack wanted to stay together and raise the baby despite everything. So Christian Barnes this time not only sells Juliet's second baby or gives it away, we're not sure, but she sells Juliet herself, separating her from Jack and her local family. So how do you hold these two people in your hands, right? That this one woman has this really complicated story. And so I think also, given what I just told you about Juliet and her babies, you can understand why Prince Demah would not be forthcoming about his patriot principles living in this staunchly Tory woman's household. But time would tell that Prince Demah was not, in fact, of Tory principles. And this is, in a way, not surprising because as a Black mariner from Massachusetts, he was part of multiple communities with fierce traditions of agitating for liberty before he went to London and was exposed to Robert H. Pine and his ideas. Because sailors had long embraced radical ideas about liberty. And by 1770, when he goes to London, Black New Englanders already had a long tradition of petitioning for their own freedom. By contrast, Henry and Christian Barnes were not only enslavers, but staunch Tories or loyalists. And there's, again, there's a side to every story. Theirs was a household where politics took center stage, in part because, unlike some people, they weren't hypocrites about it. Um, Henry Barnes refused to engage in the imports against British goods in the wake of the Townshend duties, and he was called out more than once. And this led to a dramatic incident a few months before he and Demah set sail for London to send a message to Henry Barnes. And that was the tarring and feathering of a horse in his name. So by the time this event took place in the summer of 1770, Henry Barnes, whom you see here in his portrait by Prince Demah, was an easy target. He remained one of a handful of Boston area merchants who steadfastly refused to sign the local non-importation agreements. And in January, he was among a small group publicly condemned at Boston's town meeting. But that summer, the verbal condemnation turned to physical violence. First, men broke windows at the Pearl Ash Works that Barnes operated. Christian Barnes thought they were motivated by greed, not politics, in part because after they smashed the windows, they also attacked a wagon full of goods owned by the Barneses, abused the driver, cut a bag of pepper, which was a very valuable commodity at the time, and let it all fall into the street before gathering it up in their hands and hats and carrying it off with the rest of the load. So the next day, though, someone hung an effigy on a hill within sight of their house, with a paper pinned to the breast, whereon was wrote, Henry Barnes, an infamous importer. So it hung in view of their house all day, and that night men burned it. And later that same night, local Liberty men stole someone's horse from a nearby stable, tarred the horse, its saddle and bridle, then mounted another effigy on its back, setting him loose about town, again with the paper pinned to the breast of the effigy, which in sum wished the Barneses all in hell. So this is the only recorded instance of an animal being tarred and feathered during the Revolutionary era. And you can imagine it no doubt made a chilling and lasting impression on the people who saw it, particularly the people whose names were being attached to it. And I think for those of us looking back in time, it's also a chilling reminder of the violence simmering below the surface, often violence practiced by patriots in the American Revolution. And this is a violence I think that's still not often recognized in how we collectively remember our revolution. So, for example, the very famous image on the left, which is, of course, Paul Revere's image of the massacre in King Street, aka the Boston Massacre, in which what we know is a very complicated, messy situation is made out to be a British firing squad firing upon the innocent bystanders. And so then, too, something else about Christian Barnes's portrait here, another Prince Demah portrait, is that your eyes aren't deceiving you. There is a gash in her chest, and that is because after the pepper is stolen, the horse is tarred and feathered, the effigy is burned. That's not the end of the Barneses' troubles. Christian Barnes is held up at gunpoint in her own house when it's just her and Daphne in the home. She's absolutely terrified by this. And so the Barneses decide to cut their losses and leave. And so they are part of the loyalist diaspora. They leave to England and never come back. Their house is commandeered by the Patriots and given over to the use of Henry and Lucy Knox, which really upsets Christian Barnes because she knows Lucy and she's really upset that Lucy is not, having the nicety to send her some of her furniture and portraits. But as the house is commandeered, the story goes, the troops taking it take a bayonet and stab Christian Barnes through the heart. So interesting that she's the one who's sort of more targeted even than her husband. So when the Barneses leave, Daphne and his mother Demah stay behind. By this point, he'd already set up shop in Boston. This is 1775. And he set up shop at the shop of a watchmaker, John McLean. And he took out a number of advertisements, so we know these details. But he's not the only Black genius who lived in Boston. He's not even the only Black genius working in McLean's neighborhood, because McLean's shop was in a bustling part of Boston on King Street near the State House that served as a backdrop for the Boston Massacre. McLean's shop was a short walk both from the site of the massacre itself and to the corner of King and Mackerel, where a family called the Wheatleys lived. And of course, this was Phyllis Wheatley. Now, Phyllis Wheatley, I wanted to show this excerpt of one of her poems to SM, a young African painter upon seeing his works, because in this poem, she talks about the painter's and the poet's fire, and that's the inspiration for this book title. And so I wanted to highlight that, but I also wanted to highlight the fact that she's writing to SM, who is likely Scipio Moorhead, who's another enslaved Black young man living in that same area of Boston, who is known to be another talented painter. And so what I want to stop and dwell on here for a minute is that, think about this, on the eve of the American Revolution, there's not one, not two, but three Black creative geniuses within a few minutes' walk of one another in Boston. So, Bostonians might say there's something in the water, but I think it points to the fact that there have always been Black creative people, and that sometimes our focus on the sort of violence and sadness of slavery leads us to overlook the elements of creative output and joy that also characterized enslaved people's lives. So, among other things, I think that it was Prince Demah rather than Scipio Moorhead who painted his neighbor Phyllis Wheatley's portrait. And the reason I think this is that scholars in the past have said it was Scipio Moorhead because Phyllis Wheatley wrote that poem. There's no signature on this engraving, which was based on a painting of Phyllis Wheatley done likely in Boston. And I think it's, given their age difference, Scipio Moorhead is much younger than Prince Demah. And also the fact, most importantly, that Prince Demah had been to London to train, as he advertised in Boston newspapers, that his extraordinary genius had been assisted by one of the best masters in London, that this is an argument for Phyllis Wheatley going with Prince Demah to make her portrait. And partly because a few months after Prince Demah leaves, Phyllis Wheatley herself goes to London. And it's a transformative experience for her, just as it was for his. And I described St. Martin's Lane to give you a sort of idea of the type of experiences and sensations Prince Demah would have had. One of the places where Phyllis Wheatley went was this place called Cox's Museum. And in Cox's Museum, you could see moving bejeweled figures, so automatons, like that of 16 elephants supporting two 7-foot tall temples adorned with 1,700 pieces of real gem jewelry, or plants whose leaves were finely enameled in a beautiful transparent green that burst open when chimes played to reveal a nest with a bejeweled bird feeding her young. So you can't see anything like this in Boston in the 1770s. And think of what a transformative experience this was for Phyllis Wheatley, who, of course, like Prince Demah, was in London to further her art because she could not get the support that was necessary to publish her book of poems because of her race. And so the two people had much more in common than just their shared neighborly geography. And although only the engraving of the Wheatley portrait has survived, making it difficult to know exactly what it looked like in the original, there's some notable visual similarities between Demah's surviving portraits and the print of Wheatley. And so in the end, it's impossible to know whether Prince Demah or Scipio Moorhead painted this portrait. But how noteworthy is it that this portrait, this famous portrait, the first one of a Black woman to adorn the frontispiece of any book in this British imperial world, likely was painted by an enslaved Black man, either Demah or Moorhead. So this, I think, is a reminder that talented and determined Black creatives were not oddities in colonial America, despite the odds stacked against them. And I think some white people at the time recognized this too. People like Christian Barnes certainly did. People like Phyllis Wheatley's enslavers certainly did. And people like William Duguid, whose portrait you see here by Prince Demah, also certainly did. And this portrait is at the Met Museum. And it's a wonderful portrait. It's this tiny jewel of a portrait. And the books have titles on them, and his banyan that he wears is, signifying that he is in global trade with India and a man of leisure. And if you look closely at his chest, you'll see that he wears a heart-shaped brooch made of red garnets. So obviously the heart shape and the garnets both symbolize love and affection. And so I love the fact that his family, even though it's by this formerly enslaved painter who is not as famous as John Singleton Copley by any means, but he's working in Boston, and his family obviously loves this portrait because they not only saved the portrait, which is signed on the back by Prince Demah, which is remarkable, by the way. Most colonial portraits are not signed, but they also saved the brooch, and the brooch is also at the Met. And so I love to think of how much this meant to them. And I think it's a reminder that his work had a powerful impact on the people who chose to commission him to do it. So during the war, when his loyalists and slavers, Prince Demah's, flee to England, he keeps painting, but he enlists in the Massachusetts militia company known as the Train. And so he enlists with the surname Demah. He drops the Barnes that you can see there after his Prince Demah, but notice the Barnes is really small. So he drops his enslaver's name. And here, we're at the Society of the Cincinnati, so I'm going to drop a little military history into the conversation. So he joins the Train, and this is interesting because the Train was a pretty famous artillery unit with notable connections to some of the great moments of the American Revolution that took place in Boston. And it self-described itself as being filled with gentlemen volunteers who preferred liberty to slavery, as I'm sure Prince Demah did too. So many of its officers participated in the patriot protests of the 1760s and 70s before the war, including its second in command, Paul Revere, who you see there on the left. And its commanding officer was Colonel Thomas Crafts. So Crafts, like Revere, had a long record of activism on behalf of the patriot cause. He was a member of the Loyal Nine and the Sons of Liberty, participated in the Boston Tea Party, and fought against the British during the siege of Boston. But most interesting to us today, maybe, is the fact that it was Crafts who, when the Declaration of Independence made its way from Philadelphia to Boston, read it out loud to the crowd gathered to listen outside the State House on King Street, which you see on the right. So he's standing on the balcony to read the Declaration. So Abigail Adams was there, and she reported to her husband that troops with the train lined the streets, and that once Crafts finished reading, the other men on the balcony cried out, "God save our American states," followed by 3 cheers from the crowd, ringing bells, and cannons on ships and forts firing. And Abigail Adams summed it up saying, "Thus ends royal authority in this state, and all the people shall say amen." Now, officers leading the regiment like Crafts and Revere had something else in common besides their politics. Like Prince Demah, they all made a living as artisans. So like Demah, Crafts was a painter, although he specialized in japanning furniture. And here you see on the left an example of a japanned piece made in Salem, so not far from Boston. So this was a decorative art that fed into early Americans' love for Asian goods by using paint and varnish to mimic Asian lacquered furniture. And so Revere, too, worked as a silversmith and the maker of incendiary propaganda prints. And another officer, Lieutenant Joseph Dunkerley, was a skilled miniaturist. And here you see his painting, his earliest identified one, which is at the Met from 1776. So Dunkerley went on to become a successful miniaturist. And interestingly, many of his paintings were surrounded by silver frames like this one, made by his former commanding officer, Paul Revere. So, as a skilled artisan himself, Demah had his training, his work, and his artistic passion in common with these officers of the train. Practically speaking, however, while he was in the train, probably the fact that he was a former mariner was of far more use to him than his training as a painter. So, things like sharing cramped quarters, eating rationed meals, enduring the discipline of monotonous labor, all were common to life on board ship. And Demah enlisted as a matros, which is the lowest rung on the hierarchical ladder of this artillery corps. And so they were responsible for preparing cannons to be fired by loading, swabbing, and moving them as needed. And he was not, of course, the only person in this militia who was not a white man from Massachusetts. And I'd like to point out that the miniaturist Joseph Dunkerley was actually a former British soldier who had served in the British 38th Foot before deserting it, as he put it, through principle once hostilities began. So this is an interesting example of the sort of fluidity of enlisted men, not only across various militia and the Continental Army, but across sides at this point in time. And Prince Demah, of course, was only one of many thousands of Black men, enslaved and free, who enlisted to fight for the patriot cause. In New England, Black men fought from the first days of the conflict. At least 40 men fought against the British at Lexington and Concord. And like their white counterparts, they fought for a wide range of reason. Some certainly were attached to the same ideologies and emotions around liberty that inspired white enlistment. When a Black man from Glastonbury, Connecticut, called Prince Simbo, decorated his powder horn in 1777, for example, you can see that in addition to his name, a deer, and a really unusual repeating image of the all-seeing eye, was the central motif of a dove carrying a banner that read Liberty. So during Demah's enlistment, the men of the train spent much of their time preparing for battles that never came. It doesn't seem he saw any active fighting. And when he made out his will before his untimely death in 1778, leaving everything to, as he put it, my beloved mother, Daphne Demah, he did not remember himself as a soldier. Instead, he proudly declared himself to be an artist and a free man. And so I always wonder if he corresponded with his London teacher, Robert Edge Pine, in the years that he was painting and enlisted in the train, because they certainly shared political points of view. And during the war, Robert Edge Pine's work suffers because he becomes so pro-American. For example, he made this print called America, which you see on the left. It's an allegory in which America is celebrated for bringing peace and prosperity in the face of British tyranny and violence and death. Not something that, is going to be popular with the king, for example. And so he's living in Bath because he hasn't sort of made a living in London. And he drums up support to make this print from, among other people, George William Fairfax, who is a man who himself was rumored to be of um, partially of mixed race descent from the Caribbean, and also really good friends with George Washington. And George William Fairfax not only bought 5 copies of it to help finance Pine's production, he sent 1 copy over to his friend George Washington, saying, "Look at this British man who loves American liberty so much that he's put his livelihood on the line to create this piece of art to celebrate, the American cause." And in fact, it's still hanging in the dining room at Mount Vernon, where you can see it today. So this might have been one of the reasons why, with the encouragement of George William Fairfax, Pine, after the war, after the Treaty of Paris ends things in 1783, emigrated to America because he was intent to chronicle the great events of the Revolution in paint. But before he leaves America, he made this portrait of Patience Wright, which you see on the left, and you can see this sort of um, diaphanous mold on her lap is probably indicating one of those famous heads that she molded under her skin, under her skirts, rather. And one of the reasons, of course, that her incendiary portrait by Joseph Wright was so sensational at the Royal Academy was that this image of her, you've now seen 2 of them, right? It circulates everywhere in England. And even though that statue in the middle is the sole one of her surviving statues that's full length that survives, it's William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, who was famed for being a pro-American supporter, especially during the Stamp Act crisis, probably exaggerated, but his attachment to the American cause. But nevertheless, Americans loved William Pitt. And he famously died collapsing on the House of Lords after giving a speech, again, in favor of America. This is in Westminster Abbey because they asked her to copy a wax portrait she'd already done of him while he was alive, and they put the robes on that he was wearing at the time of his death. Now, what the robes hide is that the hands and the face are made out of wax mixed with turpentine to keep it pliable and then painted to look lifelike. The body, the feet, everything else is cardboard or wood padded out with cloth to look like a body. Now, I mention this because later, when I get to the fact that this is the only one and why, turpentine, wax, cloth, wood, cardboard, flammable, right? So, and in fact, most of her wax sculptures did go up in flames. But this one you can still see at Westminster Abbey today. And so, because she was so famous, she was someone who became really well known in a lot of American circles of important people who were not just living in Britain and coming to her wax museum, which was a popular gathering place for Americans visiting London, as well as British aristocrats and politicians. But because she also was corresponding with people like John Dickinson and John Adams, who were back in America, working for the Continental Congress, for example. And so, like Robert Edge Pine, she's an ardent patriot. You can see there she did a wax sculpture of George Washington. That is always a patriotic thing to do. And during the war, she became very vocal in her support of the American cause. Even though she had gotten commissions from George III and Queen Charlotte, there's a story that she went and berated him about the Battle of Lexington and Concord. There's no proof for that, but she definitely had the personality to do that. And what is certainly true is that she became very active in helping American prisoners of war who were kept indefinitely in British prisons without the right to a trial, without the right to habeas corpus due to the Treason Act of 1777. So at one point, as the war goes on, there are thousands of American POWs in prisons. From the high and well-connected like Henry Lawrence, who rides it out in the Tower of London, to ordinary sailors who are living in prisons in Plymouth, surviving on eating snails from cracks in the walls and grinding up bones that they're finding, in the ground. And so Patience Wright is one of the people who's really active on behalf of them, trying to get their freedom, trying to get them trials, trying to get money for them. The other thing she's doing is that she's spying. She is working as an informal American spy using the social networks of her wax museum to talk to the people she knows. And among them, just to give you one example, Lord Dunmore, whom she knew from New York, the last colonial governor of Virginia, he pops by the wax museum and they have a chat. And he tries to convince her that she should change her mind about the American war. So, you know, if you've got Lord Dunmore casually popping by, you've got some some pretty good connections. And one of the things she did was she would put espionage letters into wax heads that she created and shipped across the Atlantic to her sister Rachel, who was operating a wax museum in Philadelphia, frequented by members of the Continental Congress, including people like John Adams, who record what he thinks of going to that museum. And so she wants to be an ardent, active patriot. Obviously, she can't enlist to fight. She's in London anyway. She's not, unlike Prince Demah, she is not on the ground. But she's constantly out there gathering intelligence, maybe not always the best intelligence, because I read letters at the British Library from government officials, you know, sort of 18th century MI5. And they say, we found more of Mrs. Wright's letters to Benjamin Franklin in France. You know, some of her information is really wrong. So we think we're going to let them go through because it might do us more good than harm to let them go through. But nevertheless, she was out there trying. And she wrote to John Dickinson that women are always useful in grand events. And she also writes a similar sentiment to George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. And she had big plans for what she wanted to do after the war. She wanted to move back to Philadelphia and make wax figures of important figures like Washington. In fact, she envisioned making an entire collection of wax figures of the founders to display at the State House in Philadelphia, now Independence Hall. And she talked about this plan with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and she noted that she was motivated by her animosity toward the king, as well as her own patriotism. She noted, for example, that the more public the honors bestowed on such men by their country, meaning Washington, etc., the better. To shame the English king, I would go to any trouble and expense to add my mite in the stock of honor due to Adams, Jefferson, and others. And one of the reasons that I think she was so anti King George was that her younger daughter, Phoebe, who helped her make the wax statue of William Pitt, for example, married a very promising Royal Academy artist, John Hopner. And when John and Phoebe were married, he'd been on an allowance from King George III because it was rumored he was his illegitimate son. And when he married Patience Wright, the American spy's daughter, the king cut off his allowance. And so there was a little bit of a family animus there. But so Wright understood the symbolic and instructive importance of art and its politics. And she wanted to use her art to influence how the world pictured the new United States in wax. And she began planning to move back to America. But her plans never came to fruition because in 1786, she died in London after a fall returning from a visit to John Adams, no doubt to ask him once again to help her get her wax museum project off the ground in America. So at the time of her death, Robert Edge Pine was in America, busy collecting portraits of the same man she wanted to memorialize in wax, to include in the grand history paintings he planned to make to commemorate the American Revolution. And he was also painting a lot of portraits, not just of George Washington, but you'll see in the background the Washington's bedroom at Mount Vernon and the front parlor at Mount Vernon, which feature portraits he did of Martha Washington's, her Custis grandchildren and other relatives. And one of the reasons he was so prolific was that his daughters, like his daughter Charlotte, who you see there on the left, two of whom were artists, at least two of whom were artists in their own right. And in the 1790s, when they returned back to England from America, exhibited in the Royal Academy, they helped him. And we have recordings of the fact that he would paint, and he only did this in America, he would paint the heads, and then he would bring them back and paste them onto a canvas, and his daughters would paint the rest of it. And so this results in some sort of, I'll show you one in a second, some sort of artistically unfortunate things over time. But it's fascinating because I think it's a reminder that women are always involved in these artistic productions. And I should say that Robert Edge Pine's wife also was a portrait painter, but we don't know a single one of her paintings. They've been completely lost to the anonymity of time. But so, you know, even though his daughters are helping him paint these portraits, like the one on the right of Elizabeth Parke Custis, the future Mrs. Law, which, you know, to our eyes look, I mean, she's a little ungainly. Her neck is a bit strange. However, I would say Robert Edge Pine on his worst day is still better than what the colonies in some cases had seen before, like those very unfortunate feral looking children on the right, who are the work of John Wollaston and Martha Custis Washington's own children. And so What Pine really wanted to do, though, was not waste his time painting portraits. And I think that's one of the reasons that his daughters were so active helping him. What he wanted to do was chronicle the big histories. And he got the help of this man, Robert Morris. Here's his portrait of him. And if you look closely, you can see the sort of dark halo around his head. That's where, the head was painted and then stuck onto the rest of the canvas and painted around it. So Robert Morris was a big fan of Robert Edge Pine, so much so that he built him a bespoke house in Philadelphia that had an enormous second floor gallery that served as his art museum. Now, America had never seen anything like this before. What you had in America at this time was Charles Willson Peale operating a art museum out of his own house. And in fact, one of Charles Willson Peale's sons visited Robert Edge Pine's art museum that Robert Morris built for him in Philadelphia. And he said that it was dazzling. He'd never seen anything like it, and it put his father's tiny museum to shame. Now, this probably sounds weird to all of us listening to this, right? Because everyone thinks Charles Willson Peale, the great first museum, you know, impresario of the United States of America. But in fact, it was Robert H. Pine who had this well-funded, enormous museum. And so one of the things that Pine was working on, and one of the reasons Robert Morris funded him, was these big history paintings, similar to those we have in the Capitol Rotunda today. And here you see the only one of his that survives in a copy form, in a print form. And this is Congress Voting Independence. And what's notable about this is that the architecture that he renders here is exactly to the detail what was in Independence Hall at the time that Congress was meeting. Unlike what John Trumbull's much more famous version on the right does to it, which is glamorize it, romanticize it. So I think of Robert Edge Pine's Congress Voting Independence as sort of, the filterless version of the more famous Trumbull image we have on the right. So imagine how our understanding of the revolution and its patriots might have been altered had more of his art survived, had he, Patience Wright, and Prince Demah continued to make art long after the war ended, like Charles Willson Peale and John Trumbull. We would have a gallery of lifelike colored wax figures of founders to rival Madame Tussauds, portraits by a formerly enslaved man who was also, like Trumbull, a London-trained patriot artist and military veteran. And the art of Wright, Pine, and Demah would have created a different visual memory of the American Revolution. So the intertwined lives of the patriots in this book remind us that while the popular image of a patriot in the American Revolution, of a white man writing a political pamphlet or leading a battle charge within the continental United States, tells only part of the story. Revolutionary era patriotism was more cosmopolitan, geographically broad, and diverse than it's often remembered to be. The patriots who dedicated themselves to the cause of American liberty included Black and mixed race people, women, people from what outside became the national borders of the United States, and people who practice idiosyncratic politics outside the bounds of elected office through art, popular culture, and espionage. And fold in the transatlantic story of these creative patriots into the wider story of the nation's origins both complicates and enriches it. And as we approach the nation's 250th birthday next year, the lives traced in this book remind us that we must continue to revise our collective memory about who American patriots were, what they looked like, where they fought, and with what weapons. We must seek to reimagine what patriotism meant during the American Revolution, how important art was to its development, and what that might mean for how we understand it today. And doing so helps us better understand the world of the past, I think, but it also points us to places, things, and people that allow us to have the historical conversations that can move us forward together as a diverse nation. Places like the American Revolution Institute and people like all of you here tonight. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to having a bit of a chat as time allows. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zara. And as I mentioned before, we'll have a brief question and answer session. So the only thing I do ask is if you could please raise your hand and I can bring you the microphone. That way our friends on Zoom can hear you. So any questions?
Thank you so much for a great presentation. What do you think about the usual Revolutionary War paintings showing battle scenes, battle Saratoga, victory at Yorktown, or George Washington resigning his command, as shown here, members of Congress signing the Declaration of Independence, or treaty with the Indians in bright colors, showing the revolution as a heroic event. What do you think about these paintings?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, and I'll go back to this so you can have a comparative look. There's nothing wrong with a heroic depiction of, I mean, it's art. Art is about imagination and inspiring emotion. And certainly I think the romantic paintings of Trumbull in the Capitol Rotunda are meant to, awe and inspire. And but what Robert H. Pine wanted to do was do that as well, but do it as more of a historical endeavor. And so that was why he was so intent on getting individual portraits of every single one of the men who's depicted in that scene. And that I think is why he very faithfully rendered the architectural setting instead of, Trumbull adds some velvet curtains and raises the height of the ceiling and, makes it more grand. And so I think that Robert H. Pine and Patience Wright were two people whose art was striving to be more realistic in some ways. And so I think we need to remember in an age before photography, something like a wax figure um, sometimes horrified and sometimes dazzled people because it was so hyper realistic. And people weren't used to seeing hyper realistic things, representations of human beings, right? They were used to either seeing an actual human being or things that you could tell were a print or, a painting. And so Robert H. Pine, not as much so, but Patience Wright, with her wax figure museum that she planned to have in America, would have given us, John Adams with the appropriate paunchy belly and, Ben Franklin appropriately bald without the sort of, things that are very hyper realistic. And so I don't think there's anything wrong, certainly with heroic art. And, I love Trumbull and Copley and all the rest. But I think it's really intriguing to think about what the revolution looks like on a more realistic basis, just as I think it's important to remember about the violence that is underneath, the sort of decorous, graceful falling back and dying in something like the death of General Warren. Yes. Mhm.
Yes. Thank you. I wondered about what Prince Demah and perhaps other artists who were you mentioned who were of African heritage, part at least. Why were they patriots for the American side since they were still slaves? At least Prince Demah was, and we didn't even in the North abolish slavery instantly after the American Revolution. It went on for a while, at least. So did you have any insight into what their hopes were?
Yes.
I just add that the British, ironically, I think,
Mhm.
freed a lot more people because blacks went into the British lines. And,
Right.
at least some of them got to go to Canada, I think, after.
And Sierra Leone and the Caribbean and other places. Yes. So you are correct. You actually, statistically speaking, you had a better chance at getting your freedom as an enslaved person in North America with the British than with the Patriots. And so I really think that for people like Prince Demah, they're going against the majority of what most enslaved people do. So I mentioned Lord Dunmore, he's infamous in North America for Dunmore's proclamation, which, before the war is actually, before independence has been declared, he says, if you are an enslaved person, enslaved by a rebel like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, if you come to the British side of things and fight for me, you will get your freedom. And American patriots, there's a Rhode Island regiment in which you're promised your freedom if you fight. But for the most part, you're not you're not offered the same chance at freedom if you are an enslaved person fighting for the Patriots as you are for the British. And so that is an irony to us, right? In the case of Prince Demah, I think the fact that his loyalists and slavers left to England and he didn't go with them gave him an opening for freedom that was, not necessarily what everyone was able to enjoy. And I really do think in the case of some people, it is an attachment to the ideals of the revolution, which, I mean, many people, myself included, you still get goosebumps when you hear that opening preamble, even though you know all the warts behind it. And so I think at the time people did too. And I think people like Prince Demah, we know from other things that he's attached to this concept of liberty. We know people like Prince Simbo, liberty is what he carves on his powder horn. So I think some people are fired by these revolutionary ideals, even if it runs counter to, practically speaking, what might be a better path to certain freedom.
Hi, this was terrific. Could you talk a little bit more about, I had no idea there were wax figures. What was it made of? Was it like candle wax or was there a special kind? Has anything from that period survived either here or in England or in France?
Yeah, so I agree. I think they're completely fascinating, and they're made out of beeswax, and so high quality wax. But as I mentioned, it's softened with turpentine in the 18th century, and so you get the wax, you soften it with the turpentine, and Patience Wright did, probably not under her skirt. I think that was just for effect, but she did mold, so sort of have the sculpture there and sort of free form mold it. Other people more often would do things like make a cast of a face. So like a plaster of Paris, either living or dead. There was a tradition of making wax figures of recently deceased people that went way back for thousands of years. They did it in ancient Rome as well. But so that was much easier because you just pour the plaster of Paris and then you put the wax over it and sort of pat it out. So she was a remarkable sculptor to be able to get these realistic forms, sort of free form. But what's intriguing about it is that they're then painted to look like they are realistic. And they have actual human hair, most of them. The statue of William Pitt is so really, it has little hair sticking out of its hand. So they are going for this hyper realistic form, which really puts some people off. John Adams, for example, when he goes to Patient's sister Rachel's wax museum in Philadelphia, says that he feels like he's walking among corpses. Abigail Adams goes to Patience Wright's wax museum in London after the war and is very put off by Patience Wright herself because she grabs her and kisses her, and Abigail's like, I don't know you, it's a little, but she also says that even though she knew they were wax figures, she found herself trying to talk to one of them because she wasn't sure. And how often does Abigail Adams get tripped up? I mean, this is a funny anecdote, I think. But so it was a very ancient technique, but one of the things that Patience Wright one of the reasons she was so well placed to be a spy was that there was no other wax museum in London that had these hyper realistic real people. So she had Benjamin Franklin, the king and queen. She had John Cadwallader. She had Catherine Macaulay. She had the Countess of Huntingdon. She had George Whitfield. She had David Carrick. All these, celebrities of the time. Other wax museums had fantastical scenes like the Countess of Hennenberg and her 365 children, each tiny as mice, because she was cursed by a beggar woman. So when you went to Patience Wright's, you saw real people. You saw John Wilkes. You saw, all these famous celebrities, exactly like Madame Tussauds would later do. And so it's regrettable that so few of these survive. The William Pitt survives. A lot of the profile medallions survive because they weren't on display in a museum. They were safely in frames. But weirdly, Patience Wright's wax museum ends up a lot of it in the hands of her daughter Elizabeth, who opens a wax museum in New York, which is really popular after the war. Robert Edge Pine dies. His museum ends up being sold to a guy called Daniel Bowen. Daniel Bowen also buys Elizabeth Wright's wax museum. So most of Robert Edge Pine's paintings and Patience Wright's wax museums end up in the same museum in Boston, which is wild. And then they go up in flames in the 19th century. So much of this has been lost to fire, which is regrettable. There are some, but just a handful.
We do have a few questions online, if you wouldn't mind taking a few
Of
more.
course, yeah.
Okay. One viewer would like to know, in the post-Revolutionary War years, when we were officially a new nation, was there an effort made by either the federal government or the various states to preserve art that was created to promote the revolution during the war?
Yes, a great question. And in fact, one of the reasons that Robert Edge Pine's art ended up en masse in the hands of this Daniel Bowen museum guy was that the state of Pennsylvania, when Robert Edge Pine died in 1788, his widow continued to operate the museum and ran a school for girls, she and her daughters. And among her pupils were the granddaughter Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson's youngest daughter. So you get a sense of how well connected these people are by not just who's building them a house and art museum, but whose daughters and granddaughters are going to Mrs. Pine, the widow's school. But so she and her daughters decide that it's too much to try to do these things. And so they decide to go back to England in the early 1790s. She wants to put everything up for auction. And the state of Pennsylvania says, no, we need to keep this together. This is the kernel of a national art collection. And we want to keep it together. And so for years, it's not allowed to be sold because of that very reason. There is this idea among not the federal government, but the state of Pennsylvania, because it was in Philadelphia, that they want this to be a sort of prototype of what we think of as the Smithsonian today. So very interesting that, again, this was sort of the intent and that this was recognized as early as the late 1780s by government officials.
Great, thank you. And another question. I can't help but think of that scene in the John Adams miniseries where Adams is meeting Trumbull and he's looking at this painting of them signing the Declaration. He said it's all wrong. Did in your research did you come across any well-known figures, the founding fathers, maybe even Washington? You mentioned that Pine's work is hanging in Mount Vernon. How did they feel about artists like Pine as opposed to people like Trumbull who aren't doing as realistic of a scene in their work?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's, we think that because of the people whose art has remained important and well-known and displayed in places like, the Capitol Rotunda and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, et cetera, we think that I think there's a tendency for us to think that they must have been the best. They must have been, the most preferred, when really it's a lot of it is sort of accidents of time and connection. And if Robert Edge Pine had lived and completed all his work, we would have this astoundingly realistic version of what Trumbull later gave us. And it's interesting to remember that when Robert Edge Pine first gets to America, he has an invitation to come to Mount Vernon because of Washington's friend, George William Fairfax. And Washington is kind of done with having his portrait done. He's so sick of having his portrait made. Everyone wants to make his portrait. But he agrees to sit for him, and he lets him stay at Mount Vernon for 3 weeks. And Martha Washington asks him to make all the portraits of her grandchildren and her niece. And it is because, as Washington records, he is an artist of some note and really the most influential artist they've had visit them. So to the Washingtons, prize-winning British painter Robert Edge Pine is much more an important person to paint their family portraits than Charles Wilson Peale or, Trumbull. But we can't see that because we think that the American Revolution is Copley and Trumbull and Peale, when in fact, there's this whole other subculture of American artists who are really well known, whose work is really admired, and who are giving those other artists a run for their money. And Charles Wilson Peale was probably really glad when Robert Edge Pine suddenly died, because had he not, I don't think Peale's museum would have taken off the way it did. So it's a really interesting thing to stop and reflect about what is important. What has been remembered as important was not necessarily seen as most important at the time, which I think is really fascinating.
Dovetail off of that, is that what inspired you to write this book? And I mean, what was the inspiration behind this?
Yes, partly. So the inspiration, I always say that I am a one-trick pony because so far all of my books have been inspired by visiting a museum and seeing something that sparks an idea. And in this case, I was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in their American wing with a bunch of graduate students, and I sent them off to find a painting. This history class, but I said, art is a good historical source, both for myth busting and for, evidence. So I said, go pick something and we'll come back and talk about it. And, I started them off by looking at the massive 19th century painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, which everyone has seen reproduced a million times, even if you haven't seen it in the Met. And that is the height of, heroic reimagining. Washington is standing on the bow of the ship, for one, which, crossing the icy Delaware. But to contrast that with Prince Demah's portrait of William Duguid, the Scottish merchant wearing the brooch, which is tucked away in a little corner. And to think about that portrait and the amazing fact that it is a signed work by a formerly enslaved man who goes on to fight for the patriots. And yet, that is not how we remember, Black people in the American Revolution. If they're pictured, what we remember is the Met, their image of the Trumbull painting of George Washington and William Lee, which is not what William Lee looked like. It's a very stereotyped, Trumbull has him wearing a turban and his features are exaggerated and stereotyped. And um, so, thinking about how art has been important and celebrated, but also has sort of glossed over the reality, really got me thinking. And I always like to do something transatlantic. I don't like to do something that's just in America. And so thinking about Robert Edge Pine, the fact that Demah goes to London, trains with this man, and then realizing that this man was a diehard patriot too, even though he spent the entire war in England. And then I wanted to bring a woman into the story because, women are half of history, but we're not half of history in terms of how it's written. And I realized there were all these personal connections between Patience Wright's family. When her daughter marries the rumored illegitimate son of George III, there are two witnesses, and one is the niece of Robert Edge Pine. So they have all of these connections. And just thinking about this subculture of this world of pro-Americans who are, artists and creative and so passionate about the American cause, even though they are improbably enslaved and improbably living in England, and just thinking these are not the patriots that we think of when we think of patriots. And this is not to say that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, et cetera, are not important. Of course they are, but they lived in this world where they interacted with enslaved artists and women wrote them letters saying we're useful in grand events. And so I think trying to resuscitate that world became very important to me. And I wanted to have this book come out in advance of the 250th next year to sort of remind everyone that our patriotic story is complicated. It's been complicated from the beginning. And doesn't that make it so much more fascinating?
Well, Zara, I think that's a great place to wrap up. So thank you so much for making the trip down to speak with us.
Thank you.
And thank you
Thank
all
you so much
for attending. Thank you all
Thanks.
at home, wherever you may be, for joining us online. As always, thank you all for your support of our mission. Get home safe, everybody. We'll see you next time.